Hello and welcome back to AEF TV in association with Engerati. I'm joined now in the studio by Rick Rathe from Caterpillar. Rick, firstly, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Engerati AEF TV studio. And we were talking a little bit off air, and again, one of my first interviews at AEF this morning from PwC, they said that there are 5 big mega trends.
Yeah.
And one of them is this concept of, you could call it rural electrification, you could call it community generation, but you can also call it distributed generation. And,
Right.
and you guys are seeing quite a lot of that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you see in that distributed generation space?
Sure. Well, we think it's a great opportunity. I mean, for ourselves and for our partners, the dealers in Africa. We've got a very strong portfolio today of diesel generation, ranging from 15 kilowatts to 15 megawatts, gas power generation, turbines, heavy fuel products. But what's really exciting about this new trend towards distributed generation and really microgrids is how those different elements can come together. We're seeing great opportunities for the power plants at many of our customer sites to be integrated with potentially wind or PV, energy storage, and then tying that all together with the demand response side in a distributed generation fashion. So that's exciting for us. If you combine that with CHP, district heating and cooling, now you've really got something that replaces the traditional view of a baseload power plant and transmission lines like you see in more the developed world. For places where they're still developing their grid, we see it as an opportunity similar to the telecommunications industry, where instead of building out telephone lines and systems, the wireless changed that from decades to years, right? Same thing I think is going to happen in the overall grid in terms of the developing world, and these distributed generation microgrids, whatever you want to call them, being deployed in more of a puzzle piece kind of arrangement and giving us an opportunity to really take advantage of what we've got in the generation side of it with the wind and PV as it becomes practical. I mean, there's still some challenges in terms of the cost. Energy storage is still expensive, but when you look at wind and solar, the intermittency of it is what you've got to make up. You need firm power, you need reliable power. That's where the generators come into play.
It's interesting you say about the cost of energy storage. I agree with you. It's not just hit a tipping point yet. We did a number of webinars on Engerati where there were some case studies around it from Northern Power Grid and so on, but none of them would have worked if they wouldn't have had some sort of funding or subsidy for the storage investment.
Right.
If I can take that conversation into the distributed generation, because what we're talking about here is an energy mix, aren't we? We're saying that heavy fuels have a role to play, diesel generators have a role to play, wind has a role to play.
Right.
And there's an argument that's forming that actually if you can join all of those up with a microgrid or intelligent smart grid,
right,
the need for storage is not entirely eliminated, but it's not as big as people might think.
Absolutely. And really what you're using is the diesel fuel or the natural gas as storage, right? I mean, that's a great way to store energy. It's a very efficient way to use it, especially with CHP, where you can get 90% efficiency out of it. So the energy storage really becomes the diesel or gas that you have in the pipeline or in your storage tanks. So the need for energy storage in terms of a battery or for flywheel type storage, really the time that you have to have that is a much smaller time frame. It's a very much smaller time frame.
It comes back down, which means you don't need
lots of batteries,
big containers
correct.
Full of them.
Right.
So are you guys seeing that? What we're describing is quite complex. There are many actors involved in that. What would be called, and the names around this is changing. The traditional temporary power people,
right.
who come in and say, "I've got this," and if you need it, you can use it. But where we're really going is people are saying, well, yeah, I want this, and I also want this, and I also want this, and I also want this. I want to connect it up so it's running at its optimal efficiency at any one point in time. So when the wind's blowing really hard, all the other stuff is off, and when it isn't, it comes back on. Have you seen that actually being deployed? Or is it still a theoretical concept?
No, we've actually deployed smaller scale versions of that for the military. We've deployed some smaller scale versions for telecommunication towers. So you're starting to see more of these kind of small, I call them even a microgrid, even at that scale, where you've got a generator set, batteries, and connect up to wind or PV at a cell tower site. So we're starting to see that scale up, where you're starting to see PV being deployed in mines as an example. And instead of bouncing off a grid, it's especially true for a lot of remote applications where you get into remote mines, remote villages, or remote islands.
One of the questions I've got about distributed generation, and in a specific context, which is rural electrification in Africa, who pays for it?
Yeah, that's the tough one, right? I mean, and even when you're looking at PV and wind, I mean, they've come down a lot and they've made great strides, but there's still a lot of cost in installing it. There's still a fair amount of upfront cost, which is the hardest nut to crack, right? The OpEx is very low.
It's the capital cost.
It's the capital cost.
Yeah.
So, we obviously need support still. I mean, I think the PV industry still needs support, the wind industry still needs support from governments. We need low-cost financing for those elements of it. The interesting part is that fundamentally, if the fuel cost is, say, relatively high, up in that $1 per liter or more, in remote villages where it costs a lot to get that fuel to it, the economics actually work out pretty good over that 25-year time horizon,
Gotcha.
right?
Yeah.
But the problem is you've got the first, the payback doesn't happen quick enough for the financiers or for the government to really look at. So that's where we need help. It's in the financing to get the paybacks back to.
Who's bridging that gap? Let's say, we need rural electrification, and let's get it into context as well. This is not everybody wanting a washing machine. This is everybody just wants the lights on a little bit longer, and real need. How do we bridge that gap to get that funding in?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a good answer for that one. At the end of the day, we're seeing a lot of money in the U.S., for example, for PV and a lot of subsidies. I think that's really what it's going to take at this point. It's still, like I say, more expensive or it doesn't have a good payback for that high capex up front. And it needs a push from the governments to really help, I think, accelerate the growth in that area. And in the long run, it'll pay off in terms of the economic development in those regions. These smaller projects, I think, are really what needs to be focused on. Not the billion-dollar projects where you're trying to put in a massive wind farm, but it's these smaller projects that are really going to develop the economic growth will, I think, spur further investment in the future. And again, as the energy storage prices come down, as some of the other technologies come down in price, which they've been doing, quite well. I think that the day is coming where it's really going to be attractive without the subsidies.
Well, you look at what Elon Musk is trying to do with his gigafactory.
Right.
That is about driving down the cost of energy storage.
Correct.
You can argue whether it's the right technology or whatever. That is not the point.
Right.
But I also do not think, and we're jumping around a bit, but we're talking about this in a rural context.
Yeah.
But I've seen case studies and talks by big retail outlets like IKEA, for example, or Waitrose in the UK, where what they're describing in the language of this industry, it can be described as distributed generation and a microgrid. They're saying, right, we've Walmart in the US.
Right.
So when those actors are coming into this space, that's going to create some downward pressure on the tech prices and build that knowledge about how to connect this stuff up quickly and efficiently.
Yeah.
Are you guys involved in any of those sort of projects, or?
I would say not so much. We at this point have not been involved, because in the U.S. it's really a photovoltaic play, kind of on its own.
Yeah.
You're using the large grid to bounce those assets off. There's still not any energy storage, so that's problematic. With the small penetration of photovoltaics and wind, in terms of the overall grid, it's fine today. As you get into what you saw in Germany and other places where you really start to get that intermittency from wind or solar up to a certain level, is where you really start to run into problems with grid stability and that sort of thing. But I think the solution for at least the developing world, for Africa and others, isn't really to ever create that big grid.
Yes.
You really want to keep it on a micro scale, a small scale, and deploy those puzzle pieces out piece by piece as you develop, as your urbanization is taking place, as you're building industrial parks. Have a strategy of building those microgrids that are interconnected, or those distributed generation microgrids. The beauty of it being so close is you don't lose anything on the transmission lines. You don't have to invest in the transmission lines, and you can do better demand response and manage the whole grid in that sort of environment.
So you can put that tech layer on it. I mean, whenever someone says the analogy I've got from my sort of previous life is it's like the way data centers are built now and the way they used to be. Where you had this big monolith, and if one hard drive failed, the whole thing just collapsed on you. Whereas now you can just swap it out and swap it in. So that's what we're
And there's clear evidence that concept has better energy security, better reliability than the grids that we have today in the developed world.
And when you look at taking it back down to Africa, because we're coming to the end of our time here. When you look at Africa, where are you seeing, and on a macro level, the sort of hotspots where this type of sort of distributed generation is being adopted? Or do you think that actually the entire continent is, by and large, thinking along these lines?
Yeah, I think the hotspots today are remote, not grid-connected assets. For mines is a great example of where I think there's a great opportunity to go into mines that already have power plants and using existing Caterpillar equipment and work together and come up with ways to integrate the PV, the wind, into our existing operations.
Because that's about energy efficiency, right, as well, isn't it?
Yeah, especially if it's, again, if you're in a remote location, it costs you a lot more to get your fuel delivered, so your fuel costs are very high.
So if you can offset a percentage of that by having PV and wind.
Right, and you won't offset all of it, but you can see a significant reduction in your fuel consumption. That's a win-win for everybody right now.
Cool. Well, listen, Rick, it's been great talking to you. I hope you enjoyed your time here in the studio. Thank you for making the time to be here. And thank you as well for watching. This interview, as well as I think we're shooting for about 34 while we're here. All 34 interviews will be up on the Engerati website, on the Africa Energy Forum website, and also in the Powering Africa Hub, which is a collaborative project between Africa Energy Forum and Engerati, where we're going to try and collate all this great information, especially about power projects and so on, in one central resource. So hope you check that out as well in due course. Thank you for watching.